Un beau jour, un soir, cette personne est venue chez moi et m'a demandé si je voulais me charger de missions confidentielles. Il a expliqué que c'était quelque chose qui était dans le cadre de l'OTAN, mais sans beaucoup plus d'explications, parce qu'à ce moment-là, j'étais toujours susceptible de refuser. Donc il ne s'indiquait pas de donner trop de détails, puisque toute cette organisation était absolument secrète. C'était une des organisations les plus secrètes qui ait jamais existé. Nous avions une radio à notre disposition et la base était effectivement située dans les environs de Londres et une deuxième base se trouvait du côté de Boston.
Ho fatto esercitazioni con reparti speciali americani, inglesi, francesi e belgi. Normalmente le esercitazioni consistevano nel lancio di questi specialisti da aerei che venivano direttamente dalla Francia o dal Belgio, dall'Inghilterra, venivano paracadutati e c'erano i nostri, cioè quelli che avevamo addestrati, che gli facevano le dovute segnalazioni a terra e poi li guidavano nelle case sicure.
Gladio, così come è stata definita, individuata, descritta oggi, è una componente di quelle che io ho sempre chiamato strutture parallele. C'è un esercito invisibile, non predisposto per una battaglia, una guerra esterna contro un ipotetico invasore, ma addestrato ad operare all'interno contro quello che in tutti gli ambienti militari è stato sempre definito una quinta colonna dell'Unione Sovietica, il Partito Comunista e le forze di estrema sinistra ad esso collegato.
For 40 years, secret terrorist organizations, many trained by Western intelligence agencies, have manipulated the political control of European sovereign states by a campaign of terror and murder. Originally part of a secret network, these groups changed from being defenders of state security into attackers of the established political order. Until 2 years ago, that secret network was generally known by the single word Gladio. On November the 9th, 1990, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giulio Andreotti, revealed to his own parliament and the world the existence of a top-secret European-wide network of secret agents. It was called Gladio. This network of stay-behind groups was intended to fight a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Andreotti's announcement led to an immediate reaction in the capitals of Europe. The suspicion was that some parts of the Gladio structures were involved in internal subversion.
Nous avons été saisis de la question du stay behind belge, qu'on a appelé la question Gladio, par le scandale qui a été déclenché en Italie par la révélation de l'existence en Italie d'un réseau stay behind. Et notre ministre de la Défense nationale a été interpellé par son collègue italien qui voulait savoir quelles avaient été les décisions prises lors de la dernière réunion des stay behind européens.
C'était un soir de novembre 1990 quand un délégué des autorités italiennes est venu me demander si je savais ce qu'était Gladio. À vrai dire, je n'en savais rien, sauf que ce jour-là, dans un journal italien, sur le trajet entre le Caire et Bruxelles, je venais de voir qu'il y avait un scandale en Italie, appelé Gladio.
Le ministre a fait savoir que cette chose étonnante, qu'il n'était pas au courant de l'existence au sein de l'armée et au sein de la sûreté de l'État d'un réseau stay behind.
Gladio è stata sempre protetta. L'esempio più illustre Quando Moro fu chiamato, Moro, che poi era Moro, che fu chiamato a testimoniare il processo di Catanzaro, e gli domandarono se lui aveva conoscenza di una struttura segreta, parallela, dentro i servizi, e Moro domandò ai servizi che tipo di risposta doveva dare, i servizi gli dissero che non esisteva niente, e Moro disse: sono informato che non esiste niente.
Une partie des autorités suisses a toujours su que cette structure existait. Il y avait des parlementaires qui étaient dans un conseil secret qui faisait de sorte de contrôle, mais un contrôle qui ne pouvait pas être effectif parce que nous avons trouvé que ces parlementaires ne savaient pratiquement rien.
Queste strutture parallele hanno impiegato elementi dell'estrema destra per un motivo molto semplice. È corsa una battaglia anticomunista. Nel 1945 è finita la Seconda Guerra Mondiale ed è iniziata la Terza Guerra Mondiale.
The autumn of 1944. Benito Mussolini would be dead in 6 months. Adolf Hitler in less than a year.
La bandera della Repubblica Sociale Italiana è il simbolo della nostra fede assoluta.
As the Allied armies advanced on the capitals of Axis-occupied Europe, the other war, the secret war of agents and partisan groups that had always been part of the bigger war, was to reach its own climax.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 alla mattina, appena alzata, in risaia mi tocca andare, e fra gli insetti e le zanzare, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 e fra gli insetti e le zanzare un duro lavoro mi tocca fare.
As the Germans withdrew, they left secret agents in the countries they had occupied. The secret services call such groups stay-behinds. For the retreating Germans, they were the staunchest believers. They were selected from the SS and the fascist Black Legions. They were to become the foot soldiers of the next war about to begin, the Cold War.
Le Palais des Sports de Bruxelles a été le théâtre d'une manifestation monstre consacrée au thème « Réunion de tous les peuples européens dans la lutte contre le bolchevisme ».
Nous avions vu là-bas, dans les plaines de Russie, les Italiens et les Croates, les Hongrois, les Norvégiens, les Danois, les Hollandais, nos frères flamands. Nous nous retrouvions tous là-bas, 100 ans déjà, cette force énorme qui se soulevait de toutes parts. Pourquoi? Parce qu'eux aussi ont eu cette illumination de la vérité. Allons avec foi au combat.
Ahead of the advancing Allies, always with the first troops, was the OSS, Office of Strategic Services. And that part of the OSS charged with locating enemy stay-behinds had been given the designation X2.
I came in and sent by General Donovan and got in touch with the heads of the Committee of National, the military junta of the Committee of National, which is the joint partisan groups. Andy Birding was the first X2 guy who came into Rome. And he'd been an old AP correspondent, and I thought I could trust him, that he was a good guy. And so we turned over to him everything we had on the German stay-behinds. Then Jim Angleton appeared in August. He began recruiting fascists because he figured that the best way to control the communists was to hire fascists. one of the most tough ones was Prince Valerio Borghese, who ran what was known as the 10th Flotilla. These are the guys that would execute partisans and hang them from lampposts all over Italy.
Oh, bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 mamma mia. Oh, che tormento, io ti invoco ogni domani.
Angleton made a deal with Borghese and then rushed up to save this commander from the partisans who would have lynched him any time, because he had lynched thousands of partisans.
Il principe Junio Valerio Borghese. Quindi era un uomo di un personaggio che ci porta diritti nel cuore dei servizi segreti americani. Lui venne salvato da Angleton, venne protetto da Angleton nel 1945, quando si è arreso a Milano alla fine della Seconda Guerra Mondiale qui in Italia. La 10ª MAS, quindi Valerio Borghese, 10ª MAS era la formazione che lui comandava, sottoscrisse l'impegno scritto di prendere le armi con gli alleati nel caso di conflitto con l'Unione Sovietica.
Licio Gelli, later to head the secret P2 Masonic Lodge, had been a liaison officer attached to the SS. He had his own encounter with X2 agents.
Quando sono arrivati ci hanno fatto prigioniero un gruppo di canadesi che poi ci hanno portato giù e quindi erano della OSS. Siamo stati. Io sono stato lì da loro, trattato bene, mi hanno tenuto una settimana ad un appartamento a Pistoia portandomi una risma di carta. Mi disse appunto l'ufficiale che dovevo scrivere tutta la mia vita dal momento della comunione a oggi, quello che avevo fatto. Dopo un'altra settimana vennero a chiedermi se volevo essere paracadutato al nord. Era un colonnello americano al quale gli risposi di no, che non desideravo essere paracadutato perché io avevo già terminato il mio compito.
To show what a cynical game it is, this young policeman, Federico Umberto D'Amato, the night that the Allies came in to Rome, rounded up all the German stay-behinds whose addresses he had, put them in jail, turned them over to the Americans, and they were disposed of.
The German stay-behinds were turned over to Italian authorities and sentenced by Italian military courts.
A un certo momento io facevo servizio all'albergo Excelsior, dove c'era il generale Meltzer, che era il capo delle forze armate tedesche a Roma, e lì c'era anche questa centrale dell'Abwehrluft, e un giorno riuscii a introdurmi in una di queste stanze e con un certo rischio, devo dire, mi impossessai di queste liste. E quando andarono via i tedeschi, io pensai che non avrei trovato nessuna di queste persone, invece c'erano tutti, perché era un'operazione di lasciare le persone sul posto mano a mano che si ritiravano, per cui non avevano bisogno di farli passare le linee. Qualche cosa come che si è detto, e come lei saprà come me e meglio di me, a proposito dell'operazione Gladio. E quando gli americani vennero qui e li cercarono e li trovarono che erano già arrestati, e da allora poi ebbe inizio questa collaborazione, sempre d'accordo con il mio governo e riferendo sempre alle mie autorità nazionali.
From that day of his joining Jim Angleton, or the X2 part of OSS, he ran the secret police for the next 40 years.
Molti funzionari di polizia erano stati costretti ad andare a nord al seguito di Mussolini e si trovavano in una triste condizione in quel momento. Siccome mio padre era funzionario di polizia e li conosceva tutti, fu deciso dall'OSS X2 di paracadutarmi, a me che non ero mai visto un paracaduto in vita mia, di paracadutarmi nella zona di Salò, dove per fortuna riuscii ad arrivare e dove contattai i principali funzionari della Repubblica di Salò, che aderirono naturalmente a collaborare e che sono stati poi alcuni fra i più importanti dirigenti dello Stato italiano, del Ministero dell'Interno, nell'immediato dopoguerra.
Gladio was a joint brainchild, but its most intense architect was Angleton. And Angleton, as most people know, was a sort of a professional paranoiac. One of his favorite sayings used to be that even paranoiacs have enemies. And Angleton was a fellow who felt that you couldn't trust anybody, particularly not any foreign country.
Perché più passa il tempo, più si va avanti negli studi sulla questo sia per della Seconda Guerra Mondiale e sia soprattutto nel periodo successivo della Guerra Fredda, più si vedrà che Angleton è stato un personaggio straordinario, intendiamoci, straordinario sotto tutti i punti di vista, anche, se mi permetti di dire, un po' nella follia, perché, come diceva Erasmo da Rotterdam, ci vuole un pizzico di follia in tutte le cose. E quando si arruolava all'OSS, che era il servizio da cui è nato la CIA dopo, c'era un cartello con scritto: per entrare a far parte dell'OSS non è necessario essere pazzi, ma è molto utile. E credo che l'avesse proprio fatto scrivere Angleton.
We sort of anticipated another world war, and a world war that would be characterized by an occupation of Western Europe by Soviet forces. And therefore we were preparing to set up the base for a resistance movement which could exist during the war.
The Soviet Union was viewed as our primary antagonist, our enemy, and I think that was true. The Stalinist period was a really vicious period in the Soviet Union, and we thought in the late 40s and early 50s that Stalin might invade Western Europe.
It was the plan that I knew about, that the people who had a logical reason for being in a given area where we felt it was essential to have stay-behinds, and whose activities could continue even after an attack by the Warsaw Pact. He would be given additional training. He would know the location of some of the arms and communications caches, and that he would be able, as a result of his training, to recruit additional personnel to augment his network, and that it would include not only just communications, but it would include the ability to use explosives.
The stay-behind effort, in my view, was simply to be sure that if the worst came to worst, if a communist party came into power, that there would be some agents there who would tip us off and tell us what was happening, and be around to provide the information even after the coup might occur.
With the emergence of NATO in Western Europe, in specific response to the communist takeover in Czechoslovakia in 1948 and the Berlin blockade, directives were issued to establish Europe-wide stay-behind organizations along the lines which existed in the final years of World War II in Western Europe.
There was an amendment to the NATO protocol, and that amendment was absolutely necessary. You didn't get in the door unless you signed. And what was in that amendment was the agreement of the government not to prosecute right-wing activists, right-wing activities, anti-communist activists in their own countries.
It's not unlikely that some right-wing groups were recruited and made made to be stay-behinds because they would indeed have tipped us off if a war were going to begin. So using right-wingers, if you use them not politically but for intelligence purposes, is okay.
In 1948, I was a special agent with CIC, that's our counterintelligence corps in occupied Germany. I was stationed in Augsburg, and as such, since I spoke fluent German, I was assigned to handle a network of German informants. Among them was Klaus Barbie. And Klaus Barbie was later on, I discovered that he was wanted for murder by the French, and that I reported this to my superiors, and they told me to keep nice and quiet. He's still valuable. When he's no longer valuable, we'll turn him over to the French. I thought that I was going to get a promotion when I told them about Barbie, and they told me to keep quiet. Colonel Gunther Bernau was an agent, an informant working for the military intelligence in Stuttgart. We had provided him a home, a safe house in Ludwigsburg, and there I met him 3 times a week, and he brought us information about communists and whatever we wanted to hear, he told us. He was certainly a very strong Nazi. I sat in his office one day and opened his album of pictures from the war, and in the middle of the album it showed a nice picture of Adolf Hitler. Several other high-ranking SS officers who came to visit him in his safe house that we had provided. And he told me that if for any reason he needs help, by one telephone call he could contact 200 former SS leaders from Hamburg to Munich. I remember him taking me to one particular spot, which we uncovered and dug it out, and there were rifles, small arms, grenades, all nicely wrapped in cosmoline, and he said, we have thousands of these all over the country. And that sort of made me a little suspicious, and I reported this, and they said, well, we know this. They're all working for us in case the communists come across the Iron Curtain. A former general, SS general, Paul Hauser, was a frequent visitor at Bernau's house, and they worked together hand in glove about certain programs which we didn't know anything about, and I wasn't even asked to find out more about it. Somebody above me must have been running this network already at that time.
The man in Adenauer's office, who also had, I guess, his fullest confidence, who oversaw Gladio in its earliest stages, was a fellow named Dr. Globke, who was an ex-Nazi, who Adenauer had brought into the government the way he'd brought a lot of ex-Nazis into the government, because I guess his position was that these were the only people who really had any administrative experience, and so they were, I guess, denazified, if you want to call it that. They were cleaned up, a little bit like today Nazi, tomorrow Democrat, like changing undershirts.
What we were doing is either with the government secretly or independently on our own, looking for people who might perform this function in some country where you didn't have that connection with the government or whatever, or maybe you did as a supplement. But maybe 1 or 2 extra people that would have this training who would stay there during a Soviet occupation and be the base that you could then talk about recruiting other people to join.
There was documentary material when Colby was station chief in Stockholm that he had been in touch with former Swedish volunteers in the Nordic legions of the SS, the Waffen-SS, and people who later came to be known, I guess, as Sveaborg, that he was recruiting these people.
The first scandal connected to the stay-behind groups broke in 1952 with the discovery of assassination teams linked to the Bundesdeutsche Jungen.
In all those countries, some elements of the social democratic or socialist parties aligned themselves with the communists into so-called national unity parties or socialist unity parties. The presumption was that should the Soviet army make a move toward the West, they would try to build some kind of a German puppet government in the German territory which they would occupy. The Bund Deutsche Jugend was a right-wing political organization loosely affiliated with one of the political parties in the state of Hesse in Germany. And it was deemed that these people have the motivation and the willingness to serve as part of the underground should the Soviet army indeed overrun all or part of West Germany. Now, as part of these preparations against that day, somebody's enthusiasm ran away with his judgment, and they drew up a list of German politicians, including many prominent social democrats, who they thought might be the kind of people that the Soviet army would look for in trying to organize a puppet government. When the story broke, there was a considerable flap, and it was deemed desirable that General Truscott should personally explain to the people involved what had happened. And we explained the situation first to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer of Germany. Then we explained it to General Matthew Ridgway, who was then the Commander-in-Chief of NATO. And finally, and most importantly, we explained it to Prime Minister George Sinn of Hesse, who himself was on that list. And Truscott explained to the Hessian Prime Minister that this was an unauthorized activity, to be sure only a paper exercise, but of which he was unaware, and it certainly shouldn't be interpreted as in any way casting aspersions on our confidence in Prime Minister Sinn.
From the beginning, Gladio was really divided into two spheres of influence, British and American, because the original agreement between Sir Stuart Menzies and the ex-OSS people, Wisner and those, had foreseen that the British would retain their sphere of influence in the countries that were traditionally British, such as the Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and the United States had very little to do with those. We'd see, or rather I would see, documents having to do with that, but if anything needed to be done, I would have to contact somebody who had that responsibility in DI6.
Après la guerre, le chef de l'Intelligence Service, Menzies, Monsieur Menzies, a pris contact avec le ministre des Affaires étrangères de Belgique, Monsieur Spaak, très connu, M. Paul-Henri Spaak, et ils se sont entendus sur le principe de créer un réseau stébien de Belges en période de paix, afin justement de ne pas connaître tous les inconvénients et tous les dangers qui avaient été liés à la constitution de stébien pendant la guerre.
La relation peut être privilégiée au départ entre les services de renseignement britanniques et le service de renseignement belge trouve son origine naturelle dans les contacts qui ont eu lieu entre M. Spaak à l'époque et le patron du service de renseignement britannique. Et dans cette réunion, ce tripartite meeting avec les États-Unis, la Grande-Bretagne et la Belgique.
Cominciare dal 1951, americani, inglesi e francesi per primi cominciarono a preoccuparsi di che cosa sarebbe potuto accadere se l'Europa fosse stata invasa. E si mossero in base all'esperienza fatta da due grandi organizzazioni che avevano concorso a organizzare e a sostenere la resistenza in Europa contro il nazismo: lo Special Operation Executive britannico e l'Office for Strategic Service americano.
Ces réseaux ont été constitués à l'intérieur de services secrets. Enfin, ce qu'on appelle les services secrets, c'est-à-dire du service des renseignements militaires et de la sûreté de l'État.
C'è una grossa discussione sulla legittimità di Gladio perché per la nostra Costituzione Gladio doveva quantomeno essere dichiarata nelle linee generali al Parlamento. Questo è un problema. Il fatto vero è che ammesso anche che ci fosse la necessità di avere una struttura segreta o riservata, e nei trattati internazionali spesso ci sono delle clausole segrete, però la linea di difesa di questo segreto deve andare da un Presidente del Consiglio che sia il Presidente del Consiglio che entra. Il Presidente degli Stati Uniti eletto passa 2 mesi a essere informato di quello che esiste. Quindi se il primo Presidente del Consiglio che ha autorizzato Gladio doveva dare questa informazione ai suoi successori e quindi doveva essere questo. Noi invece abbiamo trovato che, avendoli interrogati quelli che sono rimasti vivi, che una parte sono stati informati in un certo modo, molto sommario, come vi dirò, altri non sono stati informati affatto. Il senatore Fanfani, che è stato Presidente del Consiglio 6 volte, Ministro degli Interni alcune volte, Segretario della Democrazia Cristiana e segretario molto forte, non è stato mai informato su sue testimonianze, sul fatto che non esistono. Non è stato mai informato. Altri non sono stati informati.
Only those people who were friendly to American aims and policies were made aware of this. Any political leader who was inimical or was untrustworthy knew nothing.
Stay Behind Nets non faceva parte della NATO, cioè dell'organizzazione militare integrata. Era istituita all'interno dell'Alleanza Atlantica. Tant'è vero che la Francia continuò a farne parte anche dopo essere uscita dalla NATO.
Within NATO itself, there was no coordinating responsibility for Gladio. However, superimposed over NATO, there was a coordinating office in something called ITAC, which was nominally in the Defense Department, Intelligence Tactical Assessment Center, in which there were, among other things, a NATO desk. That NATO desk was owned by the agency. Although it was nominally with the Defense Intelligence Agency, it was staffed traditionally by the CIA.
Secret Service documents from several member countries reveal Gladio to be a European-wide organization including Denmark, Norway, Holland, Spain, Turkey and Greece. All Gladio's secret information is coordinated in Brussels through the CPC, Clandestine Planning Committee, which meets periodically with the chairmanship being handed from one country's secret service to the next. The entire organization is handled outside of NATO.
Gladio è cominciata in Italia nel 1951, quando il generale che comandava il SIFAR di allora, il generale Broccoli, scrisse al capo di Stato Maggiore generale dicendo: devo mandare 6 ufficiali a un corso dell'Intelligence Service in Inghilterra.
Sì, ho semplicemente assistito a delle dimostrazioni addestrative, didattiche dello staff dello Stay Behind inglese, cioè come loro addestravano i loro uomini nel campo soprattutto degli esplosivi e delle armi. E circa la presenza di ufficiali, ero con un altro ufficiale italiano, e ufficiali inglesi erano quelli che ci accompagnavano, e non so neanche però se fossero ufficiali delle forze armate inglesi, forse erano dell'intelligence.
In Inghilterra una settimana a pool per lavorare, per vedere un po', mi avevano invitato gli inglesi i reparti speciali inglesi. Sono stato una settimana, ho fatto un po' addestramento con loro, ho fatto anche un lancio col paracadute nella manica, ho fatto un'esercitazione con loro lì e mi sono trovato molto bene. Poi sono stato a Erfurt per pianificare un'esercitazione con gli SAS inglesi.
E io ebbi così delle confidenze da parte dei miei colleghi e amici inglesi che a quella base affluivano anche rappresentanti di altri corpi palesi, speciali inglesi, tra cui lo Special Branch, che è un corpo palese, che mi pare di ricordare bene sia stato creato proprio per la lotta contro l'IRA.
Le financement au départ a été pour partie assuré par les Anglais et les Américains. Nous avons pu constater que le STBN belge avait reçu des pièces d'or, notamment des pièces d'or, qui devaient servir de viatique pour les agents qui auraient dû, ou les instructeurs qui auraient dû opérer en temps de guerre.
There's a 140-man force, Special Forces. Basically, logistics, training, supply, planning. No active taking part because that would have destroyed the doctrine of deniability. So it was always, we'll help you, we'll teach you how to do something, but you guys have to do it yourselves, and we're not even going to tell you what to do, but we assume that you know.
I was once in charge of Low Country affairs, and I know how the Dutch and the Belgians and the Luxembourgeois felt about Stay Behind, and how very carefully they handled it, and how extremely secret it was. I know when I was chief in the Low Countries, the chief of service didn't want to discuss it in his office. We'd walk in the park and talk about burials that were being put down, communication equipment, or whether or not the latest equipment they had, and so forth.
En septembre 1945, je suis rappelé par mon chef, donc, et à ce moment-là, il m'envoie chez le ministre de l'Intérieur belge, M. Albert de Vleeskouwer. Et Albert de Vleeskouwer donc me dit j'ai besoin de vous, et il me dit il faudrait aller voir mon collègue italien Mario Scelba. Et je suis parti à Rome, et Mario Scelba m'a expliqué ce que je ne savais pas du tout. Nous avons constitué un réseau, c'était bien le Gladio, et il a fait des exercices d'alerte pour moi, un peu dans toute l'Italie, pour montrer qu'en 6 minutes, il pouvait être partout avec des forces d'intervention. Le problème italien n'est à comparer à aucun autre, parce que pour eux, le danger principal numéro 1, c'était pas l'armée soviétique, c'était le danger intérieur du communisme italien qui avait, je crois, 40% des voix aux élections précédentes. Et c'était de ça que Scelba avait peur. Et c'est pour ça que lui avait des dépôts d'armes et des équipes d'intervention.
There were people inside the American government, George Kennan most notably, who were arguing that the chance of the Communist Party winning the 1948 elections was so great that the United States should use military force to stop the elections, not hold the elections at all, just cancel the elections, send the army in and say to the communists, we're not going to risk elections because there's a chance of your winning. Well, this was laughed out of school by the President and the Secretary of State and all other responsible government officials. I mean, none of that was ever put into effect. And the United States said, okay, well, we'll run the elections and we'll compete in the elections.
General Marshall and James Forrestal and Allen Dulles all realized that in 1948 it was an absolutely critical moment, and that the United States didn't have, they had an intelligence service, which was quite new and young. It could collect intelligence, it could have counterintelligence, it could do everything, but it could not carry out a covert operation. There was no charter for it. And so that was remedied quite rapidly in 1948.
Gladio fu costituita nel 1948 e credo era operativa già alla fine dell'anno. Era stata composta con una grossa metodicità di scelta di persone, che molte persone provenivano dalle file dei legionari della guerra di Spagna e molti venivano anche dalle file della Repubblica fascista di Salò, gente che sapeva maneggiare molto bene le armi, squadre di 9 persone di cui c'erano 2 capi per ogni squadra, perché alcune dovevano conoscere dove c'erano i depositi di armi, i depositi di viveri e anche qualche deposito dove c'erano dei denari.
Nel 1948 parlo della mia esperienza di giovane appartenente ai gruppi giovanili della Democrazia Cristiana nella mia provincia. Io avevo 20 anni, non ero nessuno. Che un gruppo di noi si organizzò nella capitale della provincia e in altri centri viciniori e che fummo armati di fucili mitragliatori. Io personalmente avevo uno Sten, e che ci furono fornite bombe a mano dai locali comandi dei carabinieri per l'eventualità che il Partito Comunista non accettasse il responso elettorale e che tentasse un colpo di Stato, così come era avvenuto in paesi come l'Ungheria, la Cecoslovacchia, la Polonia, la Bulgaria.
There was no need for Gladio to be activated in Italy in 1948. The CIA's first major covert operation succeeded without it. Large sums of money to political parties helped the Christian Democrats defeat Palmiro Togliatti and the Communists. Earlier there had been an attempt on Togliatti's life. It's never been discovered who was behind this, but the Italian press declared that it was the work of a madman.
On a dit que c'est le CIA qui a créé Gladio. C'est impossible puisque CIA a été créé en septembre 49 ou septembre 49. Or, Gladio existait en Italie, en France, en Suisse, en Belgique, en tout cas, et probablement, oui, en Espagne, avant septembre 49, donc avant la création de la CIA. Mais, comme ils le font souvent, les Américains sont montés dans le train en marche.
After the war, a rather powerful Communist Party arose, having, I think, 21 members of parliament, which was unique in Belgium. It never happened before. And given the international context of communism, right-wing people were, of course, afraid of what they called communist danger in Belgium. Julien Lahaut was honorary president of the Belgian Communist Party, which doesn't mean he was the most powerful man in the party, but he was a symbol for workers' action. He was arrested by the Germans and liberated in 1945, and at that moment was appointed honorary president. He was also the man who, at the beginning of August 1950, when Prince Baudouin, who is now king of the Belgians, took his oath, Lahaut was the man who cried in the parliament, "Vive la République." King Leopold had been deported to Germany, then to Switzerland after the war, and center-right and right-wing were agitating to bring him back on the throne. The left wing was opposed to the return of the king, so the right-wingers were for the return of the king. And some of these groups established in 1948 its first contacts within the American embassy with an officer called Parker, who insisted on not only the Leopoldist agitation, he insisted on the formation of stay-behind groups to assure anti-communist resistance. Julien Lahaut was murdered in 1950. The man who killed Lahaut came out of a right-wing resistance group which was called the Secret Army, l'Armée Secrète. And very soon after the war, he was engaged in anti-communist intelligence and action work. And the action work was done, among other people, with Mr. André Moyen.
Ça s'est passé donc ça en août 49. Et 3 mois plus tard, un gars que j'avais connu pendant la guerre, mais qui n'était pas de mon service, est venu me trouver et il m'a dit « Il faut que je vous demande conseil. Je vous considère comme un ancien, comme c'est bon. » Et il m'a raconté « C'est moi qui ai tué Lahaut. » J'ai dit « T'es fou? Lahaut n'est plus rien dans le parti, c'est une potiche. » L'auteur m'a raconté « C'est moi qui ai tué Lahaut. » Il m'a donné des détails que seulement lui pouvait connaître. Avec qui il avait été, quelle arme il avait employé, quelle voiture, tout.